Yeah, that's what they're all.
This is the same color? Not like mine. Mine's a different color.
Yours is stone.
No.
Cloud.
One of these days, there's going to be a big change in all the prayer books.
And all the,
I want an autographed copy of the book.
who?
Cloud.
Cloud.
Yeah. That's his name too. B-L-A-T. See that?
I guess he's back in town.
You're back.
That makes it worth more, huh?
Summer must be over, everybody.
Yeah.
No, we heard the rumor.
I thought it would just be the three of us. Four of us.
Could have been.
What?
Could have been.
What's happening? Everything good?
Nothing that you don't already know.
Anything good?
Huh? That's a better. That's a better question.
Well, Iran is on the run. Good morning, dear. Syria doesn't exist. Hezbollah doesn't exist. Iran
Gaza.
has had in serious trouble. So,
They're gonna pay
there's
Gaza.
some good. Yeah.
We were there for 3 weeks longer than we planned.
I was on a cruise.
We went for 31 days, but then the day we were returning, Iran bombing happened.
Are you back for the? Jeremy, you back for the duration?
I'm supposed to go to Israel next week, but it was canceled.
I wonder what.
So I'm going to go to Ohio for a few days. But otherwise, I'm here. I'm not going to miss any more
Yeah.
Saturdays.
What?
But yeah, I'm here for the rest of the
Brooke was
through the high
supposed.
holidays.
Brooke was supposed to go to Israel on the. I forgot the name of it. It's from,
I was supposed to lead a rabbinic mission for Friends of the IDF next week. It was only a 4-day trip,
yeah,
but it was canceled.
everything was canceled.
Well, when the war with Iran started, you couldn't get flights.
No airspace.
That's all right. I'm happy to be home.
What a mess, huh?
What a mess. You know David Lawrence, don't you? Jeremy? You know David Lawrence. David Lawrence.
Yeah, I talked about it.
That was terrible thing.
Huh?
Terrible thing out there, all those scabs.
I texted him.
Who would have ever expected that?
A lot of
fast?
blame to go around, I'll tell you that.
And now New Mexico just.
New Mexico, right? All these desert states can't absorb.
You know, it's hard for them to deny that the weather's being affected.
Hard for who?
For the
Republicans?
Republicans.
Well, they
You know,
blamed it
here
on
they're
Biden.
sitting on one side, and he's saying, you know, it's not. He'll be the last one to stop denying it.
Maybe Abbott will do it when he's
Abbott said,
when he's sliding down the blood in his wheelchair.
I didn't see that. So it Hashabbat Medoratom
Marito long, Shamru,
B'nai Yisrael et Hashabbat Lasso et Hashabbat Medoratom Marito long B'nai Yisrael Oti Leolam Oti Leolam
long, Shamru,
B'nai Yisrael et Hashabbat Lasso et Hashabbat Ledoratom Barito Yishesh Shamim Asa Adonai Asa Adonai et Hashemayim V'et Haaretz V'shamru B'nai Yisrael et Hashabbat Lasso et Hashabbat Ledoratom Barito Shvi Shabbat Vayinash Shabbat Vayinash Shabbat
Vayinabash, Veshamru,
B'nai Yisrael et Hashabbat Lasso et Hashabbat Ledoratom Barito Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri ha'tofel Amen.
Okay, blessing for the study of Torah.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu
Sok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Okay, so I didn't realize there were this many Jews left in Miami this time, so I didn't make enough copies. So if you don't have a copy, it is available online, as it always is. So if you go to Torah Study at Beth Am, there's a picture of the source sheet, which is always there for people who are watching at home. Sorry I didn't bring enough. I just didn't imagine such an onslaught of Torah studiers this morning, but I am thrilled and delighted to see everybody. And you've picked an excellent week to come, because this week's Torah portion really plays along with current events in maybe a way that we haven't seen in a couple thousand years. And that is because of the first of all, the Torah portion is Balak. And Balak is an amazing story. There's a lot here. And I don't know if you were how closely you were following the news.
That's unacceptable. I said
A different form of audacious hospitality. לא משנה. Paul. זה לא משנה. כמה מושבים אתה צריך? Okay. Everybody comfortable? I don't know how closely you've been following the news, but you may be familiar that Israel attacked Iran not too long ago, and then the U.S. bombed Iran. You're familiar? You're aware of this? Okay, yeah, okay. Well, a couple of days before Israel attacked Iran, nobody knew it was coming. It was a couple of people knew it was coming. But, other than me, no one in this room knew it was coming. No, we didn't know it was coming. But something interesting happened, which was that Netanyahu went to the Kotel, he went to the Western Wall, and he placed a note in the wall. And he showed up at the Kotel. Netanyahu is not a very religious guy. He goes through the format sometimes. What he believes in God is debatable. He's made different comments throughout his career. But he showed up at the Kotel wearing a big tallis. I don't know if any of you saw it. And a yarmulke. And he usually only wears his yarmulke when he needs to, like when you're supposed to. If he goes into a shul, if he's at a memorial. And then what happens is one of his security guards takes out the yarmulke that he is in hand. The rest of the time he doesn't need it. So he was looking very Jewish. He shows up at the Kotel. This is 2 days before Israel attacks Iran. And he puts a note in the wall. Now, normally when people put a note in the wall, it's secret. Except for the time that Obama put a note in the wall and someone went and found it and read what it said, which was a huge sin. And he was, the rabbis of the Kotel, were, very unhappy with this person. Fortunately, it was like a prayer for peace. It wasn't like who could have been anything. So Netanyahu, though, it was made public what he put in. And it was a verse from the Torah. And people say, okay, great. Well, if you look on the sheet, you can see that picture of this happening. And there you have the verse that he used. And that verse comes from this week's Torah portion. And that verse also then became the name of the war against Iran. Am Kelavi. A nation, a young lion shall rise. So he put this note in the wall with the name of the operation attacking Iran that would happen 2 days later, and the note that he put in the wall was what the war was going to be called, and it came from this week's Torah portion. Clear so far? Absolutely. Okay. So, and there you have proof of the picture, and he signed it, and so forth. And you can see him with the kippah and the tallis, and that's not how you normally see him, right? Okay. Now, we don't know a lot about wars that Israel fights in the Torah. Now, by the way, before I say that, one of the things that happens in this week's Torah portion, there's this evil king of Moab named Balak. And Balak is afraid of the Jews because the Jews just conquered Egypt, and now they're coming towards him, and he's afraid they're going to conquer them. So if you're afraid of the Jews, and you know that you can't beat them militarily, you can do something else. You can appeal to your gods or whatever to try to help. And in order to do that, you could hire a prophet, and that's what he does. So there's this prophet who has a reputation for being able to do these things named Bilam. So he hires Bilam, and Bilam comes, and he's going to curse the Jews. But God comes to Bilam and says, now Bilam is a real prophet. He actually does have the ability to communicate with God, and he's not Jewish. But he has this ability. In fact, he has a very strong ability. And so, according to the Torah. And God tells him, I see you're going to curse the Jews. I'll let you go, and you're going to be paid handsomely for it by Balak, but you're not allowed to say anything except for what I tell you. And Bilam agrees because he knows that that's really what his power is. He's able to say what God thinks. And then he's going to come and he's going to say a few different curses on the Jews, but they then come out blessings. And one of the most famous ones that he says is, stop me if you've heard this before, Ma tovu o alecha Yaakov. Heard it? Ma tovu alecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. This is what's coming out of Bilam's mouth. And Balak is furious because Balak is saying, I'm paying you to curse them and you're blessing them. And Bilam's answer is, yeah, but how can I say anything than the words that God puts in my mouth? That's what I do. That's like hiring a painter to come paint your house, and he doesn't paint your house, but he does check for termites. That's not what I hired you. Right? Okay. Now, what's going to happen? What's interesting about one of the things that he says, that Bilam says about the Jews is, and there are three of them. There are three blessings. There are meant to be curses that come out as blessings. And one of the curses that comes out of a blessing is Am kalavi yakum uchay ari yitnasa, which was the name of the war against Iran. A nation of lions shall emerge, and as a lion they shall rise. That was the name that Bibi chose. And by the way, most wars of Israel, like you know what the war against Hamas is called? Charavot Barzel, swords of iron. Have you ever heard that before? Charavot Barzel. Those names are computer generated. Whenever Israel has a different type of operation, there's a computer program that picks the name. Always. This particular name, they didn't do that. This one, Bibi and whoever chose a verse from this week's Torah portion, which is ironic. It would be ironic if the war would end now on this week's Torah portion. Unfortunately, the negotiations that started with Trump and Bibi at the White House have seemed to go nowhere, which is... It doesn't help my class. Because I wanted to, which is annoying. And I've written a letter to the White House saying, I have this class. If you could finish it this week, it'll be stronger on Saturday and so forth. All right. Now, as far as war goes for Israel, when we see the Jews as a nation fighting wars, we don't see much. What's the first war? The first time the Jews are a nation, they fight Egypt. So what happens on the battlefield between the Israelites and the Egyptians? Literally nothing. God's doing all the fighting. The fighting is in the form of the 10 plagues. The Jews don't fight. Right? The war is between Pharaoh and God. Right? It's blood and frogs and whatever. The Jews aren't out there fighting the Egyptians. There's no war. There's a war, but the Jews don't fight. So then what's the next war? The Jews leave, and who comes to attack them? Amalek. And what happens? Do the Jews fight? Yes. Remember the story? Moses goes on top of the mountain, and whenever his hands are raised, they're winning. And whenever his arms are lowered, they're losing. And so Aaron and Miriam's son Hur, they hold up Moses' hands, and as long as they're holding him up, they're winning. Who's leading the fight down below in the battle? Joshua. What happens down below? So in order to understand why Bibi chose this verse and what we can learn about Israel and battle, we have to understand what happens when Israel goes to battle in the Torah. So I want to, before we look at this week's Torah portion, go back and show you the example of Israel actually fighting a war, and that's or a battle, and that's the battle against Amalek, which happens in Exodus chapter 17. So before we look at Balak, I just want to show you a piece of Exodus chapter 17, beginning with verse 8. 17, Exodus 17, verse 8. If anyone has the page in Plout, if you could. 506. Okay. Well, this is I've been gone for a few weeks. This is the first time that I've been to Torah study since Edith has passed on. And it's painful, right, to sit here and her chair is not there. So in her memory, we studied this morning. Norman, would you do us the honor to begin chapter 17, verse 8? Yehi Zichra Baruch, may Edith's memory be for a blessing. Page 506. 8.
Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, "Pick some men for us and go out and do battle with Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand." Joshua did it.
So, by the way, if you're Joshua there, you say, Moses, who's in charge, says, here's what's going to happen. We're going to fight. You go fight. I'm going to be over here. But don't worry, I'm going to help you fight. I got this stick. So I'll be here with the stick. And Joshua's like, wait, you're going to be where? With what? You're not going to help? Okay, so Moses is on the mountain with the rod. And apparently that's supposed to help the fight. And Joshua must be like, all right, you do that. Thanks a lot. Okay, so let's see what happens.
Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Then, whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur, one on each side, supported his hands. Thus his hands remained steady until the sun set. And Joshua overwhelmed the people of Amalek with the sword.
Okay, so what was Joshua's strategy down below? Yeah, so, the soldiers come to Joshua and they say, okay, what's the plan? You see that guy? When he puts his hands up, attack. When his hands fall down, let them kill you. What's the plan? What happens? What's the battle? How do you know? So there may have been a plan, but the Torah doesn't tell us. According to the Torah, what defines success or victory? The thing with the hands, right? But what's his hands doing? Reaching up to God, saying, God, you're the one who's really doing all of this. What we do down below on the battlefield is insignificant. Do you see that? I mean, it matters. So do you think Bibi went into the situation room? He said, listen, send the planes. What do you want them to bomb? Don't worry. I'll be at the hotel. When I put the note in, tell them to drop whatever they have. On what? Don't worry about it. God will take the bombs and he'll throw it wherever. I mean, that's kind of what happens in this war. It just doesn't, it doesn't make any sense that, whether Moses raises his hands or not should determine what's actually happening on the battlefield. But that's what happens. And the Torah purposely doesn't tell us what are the maneuvers. How is it working? It's weird. And so what we see from this story is that success on the battlefield is determined only by God in the Torah. You see that so far? Okay. Now, I want to just look on the sheet. Rashi comments on verse 16. So, if we're looking at verse 16, where is it? Oh, I'm looking at the wrong verse. 16. Oh. The other 16. I'm looking in the wrong. I'm looking in this week's Torah portion. Okay, so. Okay, now, if you can read the Hebrew of verse 16, you don't have to be Amos Oz to be able to follow what I'm about to explain. But in Hebrew it says, Vayomer. This is verse 16. Vayomer, and he said, Ki yad, that the hand of God, al case, is on the throne. Now, does anyone know how to say chair in Hebrew? Kisei. Kisei. Kisei can also be a toilet. It's just limited vocabulary in the Torah. But a kisei is a chair. Okay, now here though, it doesn't say kisei, it says case. And the aleph, the third letter, is missing. Okay, so what happened to the aleph? Then, the next word is Yah, which means God, right? Hallelujah. Right. Hallelujah, praise, Yah, God. But the name for God, the four-letter name for God, is four letters. It's a yud and a hey and a vav and a hey. But here, two of the letters are cut off. So there's one letter of kisei that's cut off, and there are two letters of God's name that are cut off. And Rashi asks, what happened to those letters? Clear so far? Okay, so now we look at Rashi 17:16. Anyone have a mic? Would you mind reading? I'm sorry, remind me your name?
This is Edith and my daughter-in-law,
Karen, right.
Thank you.
It was on the tip of my tongue. Karen, would you mind reading the Rashi there? Because the hand?
Because the hand is upon the throne of God. The hand of the Holy One, blessed be He, is raised to swear by His throne that He will have war and enmity against Amalek to all eternity. And what is the force of...
Like case missing the letter aleph. Like, what's the point of the aleph not being there?
What is the force of case? Why not say it as usual, kisa? And the divine name also is divided into half. God is only the half of the tetragrammaton.
Right. Tetragrammaton is the fancy phrase we use for the four-letter name of God, the yud, the hey, the vav, and the hey.
The Holy One, blessed be He, swears that His name will not be perfect, nor His throne perfect, until the name of Amalek be entirely blotted out.
Okay, so in other words, we're not going to say that God's fully present until we get rid of this threat of Amalek. Amalek is like this doubt that creeps into our mind, and we can't fully connect with God so long as Amalek is in the world. Okay, but it also indicates that the war of Israel's enemies, which in the Torah is often referred to as Amalek, is not so much a war between the Jews and Amalek as it is a war between God and Amalek. Yeah? And so it's as if that Amalek is causing harm to God. Half of God's name is missing. Half of God's throne is missing. And there's this battle that's going on. And so when we see that they actually go to fight the battle, it doesn't matter what the Jews do on the battlefield. It matters what God does. And that's why the war, according to the Torah in chapter 17 at least, is dependent on whether Moses has his hands up and prays to God rather than the military maneuvers that are going on in the battlefield. Okay? Okay, now all of that, we can put all of that behind us and skip to this week's Torah portion. We have a few minutes left to deal with it. So we're now going to chapter 24 of Numbers. I think. Um, 1178. Good. 24. Where? Hang on. 24:1. Judy, would you mind taking us? So Numbers 24, verse 1. Now we're to Balak, this week's Torah portion.
Now Balaam, seeing that it pleased God to bless Israel, did not, as on previous occasions, go in search of omens, but turned his face toward the wilderness. As Balaam looked up and saw Israel encamped, tribe by tribe, the Spirit of God came upon him. Taking up his theme, he said, Word of Balaam, son of Beor, word of the man whose eye is true, word of him who hears God's speech, who beholds visions of the Almighty, prostrate, but with eyes unveiled. How fair are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel.
Right, this is the Matovu, beginning with verse 5.
Like palm groves that stretch out, like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the water. Their boughs drip with moisture, their roots have abundant water. Their king shall rise above Agag, their kingdom shall be exalted. God who freed
Okay, so verse 7. So we have now Balaam is doing exactly what Balak doesn't want him to do. He wants him to curse the Jews, but a blessing is coming out. And then he says this weird verse 7, but we're going to get to what does he mean by the matovu. I really want to focus on the matovu, which is verse 5. So what is matovu? You know, tov means good. Matovu, how good. Ohalecha Yaakov are the tents of Jacob. Mishkenotecha Yisrael, the dwelling places of Israel. So what does all of that mean? Well, I want to show you what the Talmud says about that in a minute. But before we do that, just want to take a look at verse 7. So verse 7 is very bizarre. Water shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be by abundant waters. Now, if you ever, we don't do this very often, but if you would ever sit and study the Psalms, Psalms are really interesting, because if you just read a Psalm, you have almost no chance of understanding what it's talking about. Because what a Psalm generally is a collection of references to other places in the Tanakh. And so what, King David, traditionally, or whoever wrote the Psalms, is writing a psalm, and he'll take a verse or a line. By the way, this is the same thing with most of our liturgy. You take a line from somewhere in the Tanakh that refers to something. Then you go to another line from somewhere else in the Tanakh that refers to something else. And if you don't know what those references are and you're just reading them, you have no idea what it's talking about. So if you were sitting in rabbinic school and you were trying to figure out what a psalm was, you'd take it, and we had classes on this, and you would take it and you'd say, okay, what is this a reference to? And then you have to go and study that reference and figure out what it means. Then you take the next verse and you study that reference and you figure out what it means, and then you go back and say, well, what are those two? How are those two related? And then you see that a psalm is extremely deep. Each psalm, I don't know if any of you took art history. You take art history in college. I took art history. And they'll show you a slide of a bowl of fruit. And the teacher will say, okay, I'd like a 5-page paper on this slide for tomorrow. And I was like, you say 5 words? 5 pages of fruit. Oh, no. You know how rare that type of fruit was in this area, and you know who was able to eat it and who wasn't, and you see that it's sunny, and I'm like, lady, it's fruit. Yeah, I didn't do that great in that class. But that's what Psalms are. If you can't just read it and say, I got it. It takes a long time to develop the ideas of what's going on. And by the way, it's the same thing with the liturgy. The liturgy, our prayers are built the same way. And so what I'm pointing out here is Matovu is a little bit like that. In fact, all of the blessings of Balaam are a little bit like that, because each one is referring to something. And so if I say, well, how good are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel, I've got to ask myself, well, what is he referring to? What does that mean? And then I look at the next line, like streams spread out, like gardens by a river. What? What does that mean? Well, the Talmud's going to explain it to us. But without, the references, we have no idea what he's talking about. But there is one clue that's a little more easy to pick out, and that's in verse 7. So if you look in verse 7, it says, water shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be abundant waters. I don't know exactly what that means yet, but his king shall be exalted over Agag. That's a lot more easy to understand because we know who Agag is. Agag is? Right. He is later on the king over Amalek. And he was the one that King Saul was commanded to kill, but Saul spared him. And because he spared him, it allowed Amalek's seed to continue in the world. And then when you get to a book called Esther, you read that Haman was an Agagite. And so we see here that the war between God and Amalek is going on. And verse 7 is his king shall be exalted over Agag. Who was the first king? Saul. Saul defeated Amalek, and right when he went to kill Agag, he spared him and blew it. But that's what this is referring to. The continued battle between this nation of Amalek and not the Jewish people. God. King Saul was a king. He was a representative of him with a capital H. God. Okay, so we see that there. Now, here's where, I brought you the Rashi there at the bottom of the page, right under Bibi. That's not, in Israel they call him King Bibi. Well, 33% of Israelis do. The other percentage of Israelis call him the opposite of but, they sing Bibi, Melech Yisrael. They actually do that. Okay, so, but you can see what Rashi says there. Their first king will conquer Agag, king of the Amalekites. Okay, now, verse 9. Just take one more look at verse 9, and then we'll go to the Talmud and try to make sense of what's really going on here.
They crouch, they lie down like a lion, like the king of beasts who dare rouse them. Blessed are they who bless you, accursed they who curse you.
Okay, and I just want to point out that verse, hold on. So you see the same language in verse 9. Ka'ari u'chalavi. Right? Kalavi was the name of the war. I think it's, just find the exact verse here. It's 20, I can't find it. Maybe I passed it. Okay, so Balak thing flared. Now if I told you, Balak said, did I not speak to you? Balak, now behold, I don't know where it is. Okay, I wanted to show you exactly the verse where Bibi took the name. What is it? Oh, I'm in the wrong chapter. No wonder. Okay, so we have to go back to the last chapter. I was looking for 24-23. It's 23-24. If I was evangelical, I would have known that. But those guys have the whole Bible. Okay, so if you look at 23-24, that is the verse that is the name of the war against Iran. Right? Kalavi yakum, uchari yitnasa. And that, as you can see, if you can read Israeli cursive, then you can see in the inset of the picture on Bibi's right there that's the verse that he wrote on the wall that he put in the kotel. Okay, now what does it mean? What does it mean to rise up like a lion? Why did Bibi pick this verse? So if you look on the back page of the sheet, you have what Rashi says about that idea, of the Jews laying down as a lion. And it says, meaning, they will be settled in their land in strength and might. You can see why that might be appealing to someone who wants to go to war against Iran, right? Look what it says. They will be settled in their land in strength and in might. You know what maybe a 19th century equivalent to that language would be? Liot am chofshi ba'artzenu, Eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim. You ever heard that before? Liot am chofshi be'er. It's the end of Hatikvah. It's the same thing in different words, right? To live freely in our land, the land of Israel. It's the same thing. I mean, it's the same idea. According to what Rashi said, only Rashi said it 1,000 years ago. Look what he says. They will be settled in their land in strength and might. which to someone like Bibi, you could understand why that would be appealing, especially before you're going to go to war against Iran. Okay. Now, before I was saying that in order to understand what any psalm was saying, you'd have to do the research to do it. Well, a lot of times you don't have to do the research to do it because the Talmud's done it for us. And that's a lot of times what the Talmud is. The Talmud is looking at verses and trying to explain what they mean, and trying to explain what the references are. And so if you look now, on the back of the sheet, there's a very interesting source from Sanhedrin, which is in the Talmud, page 105b, where the Talmud explains what are the references that Bilam is using. And when we look at this, we'll be able to understand how the Torah looks at warfare. In other words, what happened when Joshua was doing battle. And then if you want to juxtapose that onto what happened in Iran, you're free to do so. I won't do that, but it's still fun. All right, so here's what it says. Rabbi Yochanan says, from the blessing of that wicked person Balaam, you can ascertain what was in his heart. Now, in other words, what he's saying is, Balaam went to curse the Jews, and though he went to curse the Jews, when the words came out, God flipped them into blessings. Why do I say that? Because look what the Talmud says. God transformed the curses that he planned into blessings. He sought to say that they should not have synagogues and study halls. Right? So he went to say, you're no longer going to study Torah or have places to worship. But what came out, God flipped it and made it say, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. How lovely are your tents, O Jacob. And so what the Talmud is saying is the tents represent the synagogues. Now, why does the Talmud say that? Because if you go back and look in Genesis, every time Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are praying, and by the way, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, they're in tents. And so it's clear from Genesis that tents were a place that they used to pray. Okay, so when Bilam says, how wonderful are your tents, what the Talmud is saying is, he meant to say, your synagogues are going to be burned to the ground, you're not going to have them anymore, and God made it say, you're always going to have them. Clear so far? Okay. And then he sought to say that the divine presence, God's, the Shekhinah, God's divine presence, will not rest upon them. And instead he said, instead of saying they won't rest upon you, he said, and your dwellings, Israel. Mishkanot. Anyone know the word Mishkanot? Mishkanot Shananim? You ever heard of Mishkanot Shananim? You know that area. Well, Mish comes from the word Mishkan, but you know the area in Jerusalem where the windmill is? It's also referred to as Yamin Moshe. But that neighborhood, which was a slum in the 1840s when it was the first neighborhood founded by Moses Montefiore in Jerusalem, outside the walls of the old city. Now you can't get an apartment there for under $10 million. That area is called Mishkanot Shananim. There's also a famous restaurant there, Mishkanot Shananim, which has the best view in the world. I was once there, and you could see overlooking, and you can see the old city. And I said to an Israeli, I said, this is the best view in Israel right here. And he said, no. It's the best view in the world. I said, wow, you've never been to Pinecrest. Yeah. Okay. All right. I didn't say that. Okay, so he sought to say that God's not going to dwell with you anymore. Now, where does God dwell? Someone said the Mishkan. Where's the Mishkan? On the Temple Mount. So what he meant to say is, you're not going to have the dwelling place, the Mishkan, which means you're not going to be able to offer sacrifices to your God anymore. And God changed it to, no, you're still going to do that, and you're still going to build the temple. Okay. He sought to say that the kingdom of Israel would not continue. And he said instead that it would continue like the winding brooks. So, in verse 6, when he says this thing about the waters and the brooks and they're going to wind, we say, oh, that's beautiful poetic language, but what does it really mean? And the Talmud says, he was going to say that the kingdom of Israel, you're not going to have kings anymore, but what God made it come out of his mouth is, just as a stream flows, so too will the line of the Jewish people will continue to flow. Clear? So you see what's happening. He tries to curse it. God makes it come out as a blessing. Okay. So far, what Balak hired Balaam to do, Balaam is trying to do. He's trying to say, you're not going to have synagogues anymore. You're not going to have kings anymore. You're not going to have a place to offer your sacrifices anymore. He's trying. But God's flipping it. Okay, that's what we have so far. He sought to say that they would have no olive trees and vineyards. And instead, he said, like gardens by the riverside. So, okay, that sounds flowery. You're not going to be able to sit there and eat olives and drink wine and whatever. Who cares? It just sounds like flowery language. But what is the point of wine and olives? Well, do you remember that with every sacrifice, they had to pour libations on top of them? And whenever they lit the lamp which they had to light the menorah every single day, they needed olive oil. And so what Bilam tried to say is everything you're trying to do with your holy temple, your menorah and your sacrifices, I'm going to take that away from you. You're not going to be able to light your menorah anymore. You're not going to be able to pour your wine. So your sacrifices to God aren't going to count anymore because they need yayin nesach, right? They need the libations to go over the top of them to make them kosher. You're not going to have that anymore. And instead, God says, you're going to have all the vineyards and olives that you need to do that. Okay? But you could see what Bilam's doing. He's trying to take away the main cornerstones of being Jewish. The kings of Israel, the holy temple, synagogues, sacrifices, the menorah. He's trying, but it's not working. Okay? Okay, next one. He sought to say that their fragrance would not diffuse from their fulfillment of mitzvot, and instead he said, like aloes that the Lord had planted, because every sacrifice also had to have frankincense. Right? The smells were important. As it burned, it was supposed to smell nice as it went up to God. And if you don't put the frankincense, as the Torah explains, you have no sacrifice. So we're going to take that away from them. And God says you're going to have all the plants you need to produce those aromas. So it's not going to work. Okay. Now, we have to ask the question. Was Bilam, forget later on what happens with the Midianite women and Pinchas and all that. We'll deal with that next week. But in terms of what Bilam wanted to do, these were his curses. They turned in, God flipped them into blessings. But do we still have those blessings? So let's take them one at a time. Do we have frankincense anymore? You could go to Dean and DeLuca, right, buy whatever, but do we put frankincense on sacrifices anymore that we have to God? No, Bilam won that one. Do we have kings of Israel? We have Bibi, but that's, we don't have kings of Israel anymore. Do we have the olive oil to light the menorah? No. I was looking for the menorah. I was in Rome. I was looking for the menorah. I know they have it, but there's only so far you can go in the Vatican before they say, no Jews, past this point. But they stole it. They admitted on the Arch of Titus. We don't have the oil. We don't have the wine. We don't have the Mishkan. We don't have the Holy Temple. In retrospect, Bilam's curses worked. From the point of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem onward, the curses ended up working. Clear so far? With the exception of one. What was the first one? Why is Matovu? If I had to pick, if I was writing a prayer book, picking the words of Bilam to put at the beginning of the service, it's like, putting Hitler's words in I mean, this is the worst enemy of the Jews. And we're using his prose to start our services. Ma tovu o'alecha, that's what you sing first at the beginning of the service. Why? To stick it to him, I like that. The one thing that he said he didn't want us to have anymore, the one thing that we still do have, Ma tovu alecha Yaakov mishkanotecha Yisrael. We still have your dwelling, we still have the dwelling places and the tents, which means we still have the synagogues and the study halls. All right? That's the one thing that we do have. We're not done yet. There's more to this, but are clear so far. Everything that Bilam said that turned into a blessing looked like it didn't work, but if you go back 2,000 years to when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, they did work. Except one. We still have synagogues and study halls. Right. Well, that's a very fair point for a Reformed Jew. Seriously. Because in Reformed Judaism, we don't yearn for the rebuilding of the Third Temple. We've taken those references out of our prayer book. We don't yearn for the coming of the Mashiach. I mean, maybe some Reformed Jews do, but officially, those references have been excised from the prayer book. But if you look at a conservative or an Orthodox prayer book, we cry every day for Jerusalem. When we smash the glass at the wedding, we're crying because there's no temple, and we're praying for the rebuilding of the temple when we can go back to offering the sacrifices. So we don't have it, but we want it. That's according to traditional Judaism. According to Reform, you're 100% right. So there's a different ways of looking at it. But traditional Judaism does yearn to return to sacrifices. So now I have people who love animals who say, "Well, I don't want to go back to sacrifices because you're so comfortable with the ethical way that slaughterhouses are run today, that the sacrificial system was much, much more ethical because they ate the sacrifices. It's just all the animals were killed in a way that they didn't feel any pain and were dedicated to God before they ate them, as opposed to the way the slaughterhouses are today, which is one of the reasons I don't really eat meat, because it's so disgusting. Yeah. They were flipped, right. The curses didn't happen when Bilam wanted them to. Balak hired Bilam to stop the Jews from conquering his territory and moving into Israel. They failed. They did go through his territory, they did conquer them, and they did settle the land of Israel. He failed. However, 1,500 years later, the Jews lost those blessings that God flipped for them. So I have to ask the question, why? God flipped the blessings. God flipped Balak's curses into blessings. But eventually that flip reverted back to curses. When? When the Romans kicked the Jews out. I mean, you could say also when the Babylonians did too, but the Jews came back from that after 70 years. So it's easier to say on a more permanent basis that when the Romans came and kicked the Jews out and destroyed the Second Temple, that those blessings reverted back to the curses that Bilam originally wanted. But why? And what's the answer? because the Jews weren't going anymore to the study hall and the synagogue. And they had forsaken God. And they were battling on their own without worrying who's on top of the mountain lifting their hands. And once they did that, and once they thought that the battle was between them and their enemies and not God and their enemies, and by enemies I mean anything that distracts you from the mitzvot, which is what Amalek is meant to represent, the blessings flipped back into curses. And we got kicked out and lost Israel. You see that? Okay. So I want to try to tie this together. In the 16th century, there was an Italian rabbi named Ovadia Sforno who wrote a commentary on the Torah, and he comments on the first line of Ma Tovu. So if you look at the first part, Ma Tovu Ohalecha Yaakov, how lovely are your tents, O Jacob. The Sforno says here, if you can see at the bottom of the page. By the way, Rashi points out that the one curse that Bilam tried to do, that God would never allow to happen, is that there will never stop having synagogues and study halls among the Jewish people. We may not go to them, but God will never allow the world to be devoid of them. Okay. Now, final point, the Sforno says, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob. A reference to the Torah academies. The word ohel, in that sense, dates back to earlier in Genesis, when Jacob is described as someone who sits in the tents, right? As opposed to Esau, who's out in the field. And I think we've talked about this before, that back then there were two types of jobs. There were farmers and there were sheep. And if you were a farmer, you had to work really hard. And you're working the land, and it took all your time, and you're always out there working. If you're a shepherd, you have a lot more free time. Because what a shepherd does is he goes to the sheep and he says, okay, sheep, stand here. And then you go into your tent and study Torah. And then like 4 hours later, you come to the sheep and you say, okay, sheep, now go there. And then you come back and you study Torah. So shepherd is always, Moses, David, Jacob. Our heroes are always shepherds. Doesn't mean they were lazy. It means they're always in their tent studying Torah. Or whatever they did, to study. Okay, so that's the tents. Tents refer to places of studying Torah or davening. And your dwelling places are reference to the synagogues of the Jews all over, as well to their temples when these existed. The reason that Bilam said Matovu, an unusual formulation, is that he wanted to make plain that the Torah academies are not only of benefit to the people who study in them, but they also are good in a transitive sense, i.e., their very existence is of benefit to the entire nation. Wow. Which means that if you're going to go to war, and you recognize that you need to raise your hands up to the heavens to win the war, then things are going to go well, and it won't matter what happens on the battlefield. And the truth is, the war that Israel fought with Iran was in many ways miraculous. And if you learn about what Israel did in this war, it may never be really known how Israel was able to gain so easily. I mean, the whole world's been afraid of Iran for 30 years. And just like that, by itself, without even American help, Israel gained air superiority over Iran on its own. Simply. Something thought impossible. And what Israel did with the F-35s and the F-whatevers, you have to listen to Chaviv Red Gore explain this. But he talks about how Israel modified the American planes to do things that the Americans never dreamed it could do. They actually put ballistic missiles on F-35s that were not designed to carry ballistic missiles, which is beyond belief. And the Iranians were just running around like with their heads cut off. They couldn't believe it. I mean, the way that the war came about, I don't know if you know this, but the entire leadership of the Iranian army went to a meeting. You know about this meeting? They went to a meeting. Who arranged the meeting? The Mossad. the Mossad arranged the meeting that all the heads of the leaders should meet the Mossad arranged the place that they should meet. They arranged that that should be the time that all of their schedules should be available. I mean, 98% of the secretaries of these people who are running the Iranian army work for the Mossad. And they all got into this room right before the war started, and then Israel blew up that room. And then when the war started, they didn't know what to do. I mean, these are things that don't just happen. This is by the way, Israel's been working on this for 30 years. It was just, the whole thing is just beyond belief. If you made a movie of it, it would not be believable. I mean, you'd say, it's ridiculous. This could never happen. And it was sort of like the Jewish people leaving Egypt, and now they go and fight Amalek. Now, these Jewish people, or these Israelites who are fighting Amalek, are former slaves with no military training who've never been in battle before, fighting an army that's trained, that is on the attack, that knows what it's doing, and that is purposely attacking them. And here are these Jews, who have these swords but have never used them before, and they're waiting for the frogs to come out. Because they're like, we don't know, what do you do with these? Is this what gets the frogs to come and eat them? Or the lice, or the, whatever. They've never done. You've never been in war before? Don't worry. Don't worry. You know what's going to happen? See that guy up there? He's going like this. Oh, no problem. And then you slaughter them. So, look, I know probably 98% of you can't stand Bibi. Whatever, I don't care. He went to the kotel and said, before we do this, someone has to raise their hands and say to God, we can't do it on our own. He's not a very religious guy, but he looks pretty religious there. And the words that he used to, I don't know if he knows the Torah by heart. He actually is very schooled in the Torah. His son was the national champion of the Israel Bible quiz, which is like a big deal in Israel. He knows the Tanakh very well. I don't know, maybe he used Safari or Googled this verse, but because again, he's not evangelical, so he doesn't know the Bible by heart. But those guys are unreal. When he went to pick the verse, he said, the Torah doesn't really tell us how to fight. The Torah doesn't really tell us how they used to win these wars. But the one thing the Torah told us is that we can rise up like a lion if we reach out to God. And that was the verse from this week's Torah portion. Now, ultimately, here's what happened. We lost Bilam's curses, God changed to blessings. But God took away, God let them fall back into the original curses when the temple was destroyed, because the Jews weren't davening anymore, and they weren't studying Torah anymore, and they were fighting with each other, and there was sinat chinam, there was baseless hatred, and the Jews weren't getting along, and that was it. But now, when we go to defend our land again, we have to ask the question, do we remember that as a Jewish people, when we go out to war, we either are going to shul and are in the study halls and are raising our hands to God, or we're not. And you could say that it's all hocus pocus and who believes it, but when you look at what just happened and you see that it came from this week's Torah portion, you have to say, maybe it's important that we continue to study Torah in the study halls. Maybe it's important that we continue to daven in the synagogues. Maybe it's important. What ultimately that means is because you know what it means when Jews are in the study halls and in the synagogues? It means that we're united. And when we're united, that's when we can go out and actually win the wars. Bezrat Hashem, with God's help. Okay, Shabbat Shalom.
Ah, sí, Ajá.
Brazil would be nice. Travis, is that I'm Preston, I'm good. Yeah, for sure.
check, check, check.